Yeah,
I can
but
just
we
do
have
it.
two people
You have, right,
on
switching back.
here. Which
Do I need to do anything except just plug in my computer?
No, just
Okay.
plug in
Great.
and you can use your up and down buttons.
Okay.
So you actually got easy
Right.
because
Okay. You're the
they
one.
have to look here,
Okay. Okay.
stand there, and use the clicker.
Okay. Yeah.
So like
This is the you know it's always a little fussy on the side of the presenters to have their computers, but it's the one that you can kind of control a little bit. But
usually they have an issue.
recording is there. Yeah. Great.
Okay.
Flexible. But thank you for the help and keeping all organized. Have you been finding that generally the IT world is
that hard to develop shoulder trials?
Can I quickly go out and get some coffee?
You might be able to come back to the
Okay, then I will go.
Yeah, I just keep thinking about the fur trappers on the St. Laurent. 17, 15.
Oh, okay. So pretty impressive. It's like you probably the one who notices more of what the
basically we're trying to get ready for it. So every time like tomorrow's event we say we're going to flights.
Oh yeah.
Then
Okay.
you have to
Yeah.
they're actually supposed to happen.
I was wondering about this
So
stage
we're kind of because tomorrow is going to be
Oh, is that right? Okay.
so every time there's something new or
Yeah.
they can change, but that's okay. That's why we're doing it.
Well, I think that I have a sense, right, this is for rhetorics and having fun playing with the space. Yeah.
This one is so you can enjoy it.
Okay, so yeah, we should probably get started
I
soon.
still need to mic Richard.
Yeah, I'm gonna go grab one.
Orit, sorry guys, we're about to start. So this just on the rear.
I'm probably going to have to put this on the podium.
Yes, that's okay. Just remember, no light off. Green light to light.
Okay.
Actually, maybe I might have done this recently. It's my
Green light. You can put it in your pocket, whatever is convenient for you. Your presentation is here, right? Correct? You send the file to us.
Yes.
So basically,
Why are you standing there?
you'll be standing here, the screen is here, and you have a clicker.
Okay.
Okay? I'll twist it a little bit closer so it will be easier to see. Yeah. So waiting on Richard.
You're looking good. You're just standing there.
I'm just standing there. Well, that's part of smartness is to have a well-dressed slide. Smartness is also about how you smart look.
I'm gonna have to stand there with this just first, so.
You're live.
I'm live. Shouldn't say anything bad.
Is there because we'll need a water walla produced.
Where is the water? Let's see. Nene. Where's the water? It's like the bullpen here.
Yeah.
Okay. Good evening. Thank you all for coming out on this blustery winter night. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Richard Sommer, a professor here at the Daniels Faculty and Dean of the Faculty. Before we get started, I'd like to share what is now a common practice here, our land acknowledgement. I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So, tonight's event is part of the Daniels Home and Away series, which, as the title of the series suggests, brings together talent and ideas from near and far for a series of discussions and debates on design issues of global importance. Actually, and tonight's event was originally built around the two Jessies that are part of the panel tonight. Our version of Home and Away tonight is that both Jessie LeCavalier and Jessie Shapins are from away, but now they live in Toronto. So they're from both home and away in a sense. They're recent transplants to the city, and we thought this would we build this event around them as a kind of welcome to the city. So. For those of you who are, by the way, who are social media savvy, I encourage you to use the hashtag Urban IQ test on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and this is all being live casts on those various channels. So for those of you who may be watching us live from the comfort of your own devices, welcome. Before we get started, I'd also like to thank the University of Toronto's new School of Cities, which the Daniels Faculty is a founding partner in, and help them for supporting this event. Launched just this year, the School of Cities brings together more than 220 researchers from over 40 academic units and divisions across the University of Toronto. By tapping into U of T's rich pool of talent around all things urban, the School of Cities' mission is to create new opportunities for cross-disciplinary collaboration and to help address the myriad challenges facing the world's urban areas. So tonight's panel is the keynote of our Urban IQ Test Symposium, and it's meant to kick off a deep dive into some of the contemporary rhetorics, histories, and politics of the smart city phenomenon. We have convened a group of experts whose knowledge from research and practice will inform what I expect will be a lively and thought-provoking discussion on what we might actually be talking about when we use the term smart city. As a reminder for those of you who want a deeper dive, again, the symposium starts tomorrow from 9:30 and concludes at 4:30. Like this evening, it is free to attend and open to all of you, so I hope to see you back here. So there's a question you might ask, or at least I've asked, why are we doing this and taking on this subject? Because there have been many discussions about smart cities. We know that the concept of the smart city has become ubiquitous in the contemporary agendas related to urban planning, governance, and design, and within technological industries wishing to plan, build, and manage cities, now actually on a global scale. A few years ago, in connection with work that our Global Cities Institute is doing, I attended an annual conference on smart cities in Barcelona. Now, something like 250,000 people attend this conference. It's more like a huge trade fair. And there are software companies and large infrastructure, providers, and they're building and industry product developers and manufacturers. But what I didn't notice or didn't see in this place was any really architects, or frankly architecture, and very few city planners either. So I thought, this stuff is already actually being baked into what we do, and we're probably not looking enough at it or taking it enough into account. And then here at our university, our engineering and computer science colleagues are hard at work developing what they call smart technologies, and often from a very different perspective in the social sciences, colleagues are exploring the smart city from a policy and political rights, privacy, and let's say citizen empowerment perspective. Yet despite its widespread use, this concept of the smart city remains, I think, very fuzzy in definition, and it changes depending on the disciplinary, ideological, and geopolitical context in which it's being used. And I think in the school, we think it's important for architecture, landscape, and urban design to be able to really, as a field or fields, partake in research and projects and debates on this topic with our colleagues in other fields, and more broadly with the public and private sector. But we actually, I think, before we do that, have to have our thinking and approaches in order. We know that the smart city is typically represented as a highly integrated hardware and software platform of technological tools meant to facilitate faster, more responsive, and efficient forms of urban communication, the provision of human services, and resource management. That is, a universally adaptable, politically neutral solution with the potential to improve quality of life across all social sectors in what we know is an increasingly urbanizing world. But is the smart city really just another hyphenated term like smart car, or smartphone, or smart house, or smart refrigerator, meant to describe how new digital technologies can expand the functionality and enhance the responsiveness of an existing object? Or is the smart city something more ambitious or even sinister in that it wants to be the nexus in which all of these smaller, more targeted cellular technologies are clustered and integrated into a more hive-like whole? So we've called this the urban IQ test because for cities, as for people, the very notion of what constitutes intelligence is complex and somewhat fraught. As we know, in the case of people, that there are multiple kinds of intelligence, and we need those to actually have a successful society. So in both the emerging practices that are propelling the development of smart urbanism, there is an unresolved tension between the newer, faster, digitally driven, soft economies and technologies transforming communication and social life, and the more established, and I would say slower, hardware that characterizes the construction of the built environment. And so this is the background and question, this gulf between the, let's say, the soft, faster technologies and the hard, built city that we're going to begin to get into tonight and build on tomorrow. So I want to introduce our esteemed panel for tonight, bring them up to the stage, and they're going to make a series of short presentations, and then we're going to see if we can hash out our ideas across the stage. So to start, I'd like to introduce you to Orit Halpern. Orit is a professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Concordia University. She bridges the history of science, computing, and cybernetics with design and art practice. Her work focuses on histories and practices of big data, interactivity, and ubiquitous computing. Her book, Beautiful Data, A History of Vision and Reason Since 1945, examines our contemporary obsessions with quote-unquote big data and data visualization. She's also currently working on 2 books that will inform our discussion this evening. The first, called The Smartness Mandate, and the second, Resilient Hope, which will examine, quote, forms of planetary futures being produced and destroyed through high technology and large-scale infrastructural projects. So I thought we were going to introduce everyone and all come up onto stage. Is that okay? Or should we do it one at a time?
One at a time because we can see what
Okay, so why don't we just start with Orit, and I'll introduce the others from the audience. Orit Halpern.
Thank you so much, Richard, and all of you for being here, for starters, for another discussion about smartness. Hold on. I think you took my notes.
Your notes? Okay, that's a problem.
Sorry, it's okay. I need more smartness in my life. I think they're in the middle.
No.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, great. So I'm a historian, not designer, I'm not ethnographer, but I do believe I create fictions and narratives, and that in the long run, they're important. So without further ado, I'm just going to throw out some thoughts I had. I was asked to do this, so this is just speculative thinking. So what is this smartness thing? Here's some definitions I found. It can be programmed to make autonomous decisions. Witty and intelligent, showing or characterized by quick and inventive verbal humor. It can be well-dressed. There's a smart casual, might I add, that you can put in it. It can be painful, as here's George Eliot in Middlemarch, with memory set smarting like a reopened wound upon thinking about lost love, or just stinging and painful. How quickly, then, when speaking of smartness, does humor become violence when dealing with these new forms of intelligence? But it's funny. I really only hear a lot about the pain. Whether happy or sad, smart cities always seem to be pessimistically optimistic. While the images are bubbly and pretty and optimistic, the problems are not. Energy, catastrophe, financial volatility, supply chain disruptions, class violence, environmental degradation, you name it, our cities must deal. And in doing this dealing, our images of our future seem always already here. We all know the story about smart cities. They're perfectly parametrically designed and integrated landscapes. Perfectly parametrically designed and integrated landscapes, fully integrating all relationships. Sorry, it's supposed to go. Just playing. Why is this not? Okay. We all know the story about smart cities, perfectly parametrically designed and integrated landscapes, fully integrating all relationships between things. There are no more objects or subjects, perfectly automated or least mediated, all through these computing systems that are now literally climactic, creating logistical infrastructures, binding energy to information in ways that will create this known future. And these sort of forms of smartness facilitate, of course, new forms of extraction. These are all images from some of the work I've done. An operationalization, if not computationalization, of the planet that certain people call global urbanization, that have created, if we will, new forms of resource extraction and environmental violences is here. That all leads, that's linked together through logistical systems, in turn creating new forms of precarity in terms of human well-being and labor, as demonstrated in these Kolkata ports that I've been working on, that result in these supposedly essentially luxury condos that are all essentially empty, funded by credit debt swaps and asset-backed securities, all of which are also algorithmic, that use these materials that destroy the earth
or relax.
but evade danger because the risks have already been swapped and traded, hedged, and a hedge bet we can never lose. Even our fantasies about the future seem to be colonized by this seamless vision of the city. Our science fiction, it seems like we can no longer dream except in LiDAR through the actual spectra of our extrasensory prosthesis through machines. And I worry a little bit about how we're dreaming our futures, actually. I mean, I like some of these projects, but I'm wondering if we just kind of occupy these spaces, now melancholic about our ruins, as unable to fantasize a future outside of the parametric designs and algorithmic modes of logistical capacities. But I'm a historian of science. I study the history and genealogy of these things we now call smart. I study neural nets and perceptrons and machine learning systems. I also study the sciences that came along with these new ideas about how minds emerged, such as about cognitive psychology, ecology, sociobiology, and machine learning. And I want to remind myself that I would prefer to be a cyborg than a goddess. This talk will not be at all about hating technology. Rather, it will be how shall we create other relations with technology and others that might produce a world that is less known. How do we even learn from these things like logistical systems? I'm sure Jesse will talk about this. And from the kind of constructs that we have that might surprise us or change the way we're imagining the future. And I was recently thinking with my colleague, Jason Lewis, who works on indigenous futures at Concordia University. He recently wrote an essay with Noeleni Arista Archer Picawis, I'm sorry about my pronunciation, and Suzanne Kite about making kin with the machines. Using the ontologies and epistemologies of the Lakota, Cree, and Hawaii, they wanted to ask if there's something different about how we might approach those things that are inanimate and animate but not human that might transform our discourses away from those of extraction, optimization, resilience, the forms that we're used to in terms of how we discuss smart cities, towards something else. And they basically open this discussion by actually talking about a recent discussion that Jori Ito of Media Lab said. In this discussion, the problem, so their argument about Jori Ito's argument, he said that we need to abandon or not be reductive, which is great in theory. And then he also quoted Norbert Wiener saying we shouldn't just use machines as slaves. But the problem, they argued, is that anthropocentrism continued to permeate this manifesto for a call for a new form of artificial intelligence. And primarily they cited this in his applause of the IEEE support of an idea around human-centered design and design for human well-being. At first, this might seem unintuitive, but basically, one of the things I'd like to argue that we can learn about smartness that might actually be able to change our modes is to call for an other design. For some, I don't want my future city for myself to be just about humans. I might not want it to be human-centered at all. Lewis and his colleagues go on to argue through a series of discussions I can't really repeat, but what they remind us of is that it's not just about loving machines. It's about the fact that many other human beings don't even have the distinction of being human, and that in continuing our idea of human-centered design, we ignore the histories of finance markets and logistic systems, such as exemplified in this slave ship here, from which our contemporary cities emerge. And in many ways, we've refused, and there is some discussion, but I do believe we have to take more seriously the idea of what new forms of concepts, what new forms of glossaries, what new forms of ideas might we have vis-a-vis place and space and territory and materials that might break or decolonize design and engage with other forms of knowing and being in the world. And from my own, but another place one can also think about in terms of how we might develop this alternative, if you will, ontology or epistemology of designing smart seasonness is also from the histories and genealogies. So what are the things that I've learned from studying about smartness? The first thing I've learned, lesson 1, is that smartness is not reason. It has no care for the Enlightenment. When I studied the history of things like neural networks that are now kind of the predecessor of things like deep learning nets, I was first to remember that for cyberneticians in the 1940s and 50s, both machines and minds were unknown. They did not ask if minds and machines were alike, but rather if a neuron had certain properties, what could it do? What could we build? These were, in their terms, experimental epistemologies. And their main and central premise was that the mind and the body were linked, that materials could think, and that there's no abstraction versus materialism. Our machines have taught us that many things, therefore, are material, and that all thinking is embodied. How can we take that seriously? But not all thinking is the same. As Alan Turing said in the movie The Imitation Game, and I quote, "You're asking the wrong question if you ask, are machines and minds the same? It's not whether machines can think like us, but rather that these are two different types of thought. And we should recognize this. Our machines can reveal this to us. But they also revealed that nature had many intelligences. Sociobiology, ants, swarmed, organized behaviors, all of these inhered in the sciences that have emerged since World War II. So this is just my example. We even have plant intelligence today. The tiny grass is dreaming. But of course, also self-organizing systems such as ants that demonstrate a different idea and that, in fact, today could serve even as inspiration to us. And this is a colleague of mine at McGill, Simon Craig, has worked on this building that's kind of grounded in the architecture of ant hills. So are there ways that we can rethink our relation to others that may also inform our work? Smartness is also ecological. Of the many things that emerged from cybernetics was the enhancement and improvement of the sciences of ecology. In fact, and this is an example of Richard Neutra's design for Puerto Rico that were never built, but there were a lot of ideas about using local climates to actually moderate the building. Within some of this modernist design, but also in many other designs of others, cultures, inside and outside are no longer so clear, just as with these homes, and increasingly the term environment, if we mean something outside, has been eclipsed since the end of the war with the term ecology as some circuit of relations. And this is really critical in terms of our continually being able to extend the idea of what is urban. And in fact, we're working hard to rethink things like urban-rural divides and other such steadfast and Cartesian notions that underpin the city as we often think about it. Ecologies are also about populations and managing them. So smartness is also about data. In that sense, it heralds back to eugenics and the normal curve, as you can see behind me. And in fact, the racist IQ test for which this conference is named. And here you see eugenics from Galton, which kind of is underpinned by this idea of a normative or singular intelligence. And if there's one take-home thing I'm saying here is that smartness actually opens us to not having an IQ, and I'll talk about that. It's also a new use of population. Population as a medium and as a potential, as a multiple thing without one norm, but also an idea that populations might learn. So in my work, I've been looking at people like geneticist and evolutionary biologist Ernst Mayr, who during the 50s started to come up with ideas of how differences between populations can produce change, and how populations actually become something not that's stable and just needs to be managed out there, but actually learn. Something that is both at the heart of many of our concepts of big data and machine learning, but at the same time could be activated to de-essentialize and destabilize ideas of determinism, both genetically and otherwise. And of course, these new data also force us to think about new ways by which to visualize and rethink visualizations in terms of thinking not as populations, as stable things, but as things that are created through historical and social forces to create possibilities or failures of potential, or to close off possibilities for different forms of life. And finally, as I said, this turn to ecology and population has transformed our idea of what a city is. So this is just a famous case I often talk about, which I'm sure you all know, where the idea of, for example, recruiting wetlands and retransforming the territory of the city is something that comes out of ecology. My question is whether or not we might be able to think about ecology not just in terms of like what we say now, ecosystem services, but in terms of other terms. Are there ways, should we be using terms like capacities, affordances? I don't have ideas about this, but what does it mean to actually, can we design not just oysters to like save us and please us and so we can eat them and consume them, but actually to design also for the oysters in some way that is meaningful, and that ultimately that would be a change. So I applaud this kind of transformation in how we're thinking territory and population. Well, I also ask if not we could learn more about this forms of smartness and that could rethink the kind of basically extractive modes that we're working. And finally, smartness is not artificial. That's my final little lesson. To look smart, it has no one norm. To look smart is not to be fake. It's just a special look, a call to others perhaps. To feel pain is real. As so many queer bodies, racial bodies know, as Judith Butler has called us out in Gender Trouble, these forms of smartness are also forms of being able to produce difference in imaginary and to be able to create oneself not only within the strictures of the normative societies in which we live. And for African American queer men in movies like this, it is fundamentally about dreaming something that is not likely but still possible, which is to be unencumbered through the racist, hegemonic patriarchy in which they live. So I want to think, and I want to return to Lewis and their call to use Cree, Lakota, and Hawaiian ontologies to rethink the modes of relating to non-human, animate, and inanimate things. As I also call on certain forms of Afrofuturism to help us rethink, is there a way that we could imagine connectivity, custodianship, and covenants to each other and others? While the idea of making an AI your kin is seemingly ludicrous, it's sort of a speculative fiction, I think it's critical to try to ask about what kind of terms we could do in order to transform our relations to ourselves and our technology, not by disavowing the technology or throwing it, not because we're imagining it's out there or done by somebody else, but rather by trying to activate what the machines themselves can do. So even as we learn from logistics, algorithms, the reasoning of corporations, can we queer those things? Can we try to imagine not a world that's already here, as so much of speculative design does, but something else? I kind of think about Alexa, and I'll just end on this. If I say to Alexa, I love you, this is sort of an interesting thing. It doesn't really know what to say. Perhaps I want shoes. Perhaps I would like to buy some chocolate. In that moment where Alexa doesn't really understand me, I recall the work of Sarah Sharma here also at Toronto, who argues that in the version put forth by the Stepford Lives, all women are broken machines. And in that moment, when the Amazon Alexa is busy learning from me, and that learning is extractive and evil and violent, but it will also be erring and pleasureful, since Alexa doesn't really get me, and I usually don't get my boyfriends either, and may eventually, if we imagine some new forms of relationality, not just serve patriarchy. Alexa makes female being itself a form of performance that could be maybe reverse engineered to expose the algorithms of patriarchy made visible every time it fails to understand my request. Perhaps that just reveals something that we've known all along, something I really want to activate in smartness, that the world is beyond us and that we're all interconnected. So thank you. I'll end there.
Thank you, Orit. Next up is Jesse Shapins. Jesse's a leading designer in the fields of media and technology, and he is currently serving as director of the public realm at Sidewalk Labs, where he leads vision, strategy, design, and prototyping for the future of public space there. Jesse was previously the director of product for BuzzFeed and also a co-founder of Union Docs, a leading center for documentary arts in the United States. So, welcome, Jesse.
Great. Thank you, Richard. And you didn't tell me that this was a generous welcoming, but that is so wonderful to think about a generous welcoming with another Jesse.
It's a double Jesse welcoming.
And it's a real honor to follow that presentation. So what I'll be doing, and this is a little less sort of a kind of formal set of prepared remarks, but a set of notes and just sort of reflections. I won't be presenting on the Sidewalk Toronto project. I think you all know quite a bit about that work. If there are questions, I'm happy to speak to them. But more sort of reflecting on some of the thinking that I've done through my course of my career in kind of explorations of the topic of the intersection of technology and cities. So when I started to think about and think about this question of today, the question of the smart city, I went back to one of the kind of sets of writing that has informed my thinking is a book actually called On the Smart City by Antoine Picon. And he writes something that I think is quite useful. And he says, the quest for the smart city has taken two separate paths that may appear contradictory at first glance. It is as if the two distinct projects were merging simultaneously in the name of a single ideal and within a single movement of transformation through information and communications technology. The first identifies itself with the cybernetics of the 1950s and 60s, as we heard a bit about in a way here, and its desire to anticipate... What's that? Oh, sorry. I was a bit confused. Okay, I will keep the 50s and 60s. There's a feedback loop that's important in that period of time. It's a feedback loop that's important now. But in that cybernetics of the 1950s and 60s, and its desire to anticipate and master everything, seemingly in opposition to this neo-cybernetics inspired smart city, with its deliberately technocratic emphasis, is the notion of a city that sets out to reinvest its citizens with the capacity spontaneously to invent community living, reviving the sense of festival, whose disappearance from contemporary urban experience was lamented by the situationists and indeed by the French sociologist Henri Lefebvre. So here, in a way, you have this juxtaposition of, on the left in this picture, a kind of command and control center that is a familiar image of a certain type of smart city thinking, and on the other side, the famous drawings of Guy Debord and the situationists of Paris. And I think it's that combination, in a way, that I think is fascinating to recognize here, that tension of a desire and an opportunity to try to pursue more understanding, but a long-standing understanding that the great things about cities are, in effect, the unknown, the uncertain, the spontaneous. And the other person on smart cities that I think a lot about is Francesca Bria, who some of you might know has done incredible work in Barcelona. I don't know if she was there with the 250,000 other people in the ICT industry, but she's doing incredible work there, leading it from the public sector side. And she says, it's the drive to give technological sovereignty to citizens. That's how she defines the smart city. And what that means is then the question of what is technological sovereignty of citizens. And her answer is it's the determination to put urban policies and the big challenges of the city before technology. It's quite simple in a way. It's to say that it's not really about smart or any other word, it's about the city. Let's focus on the city, and let's focus on things that matter in cities. Let's focus on housing. Let's focus on jobs. Let's focus on transportation. Let's focus on the environment. And there might be opportunities where technology can play a role to have an impact on those areas. So for me personally, the way that it's also been an exploration in these areas, not always quite at the kind of nature of sort of topics of housing or transportation, but this is not a new phenomena, the question of the relationship of technology in cities, of course, and it's not even a new phenomena, the question of the relationship of kind of mobile and network technology. Even for myself, about 14 years ago, was participating in an early conference on ubiquitous computing when starting a project that was called Yellow Arrow. This is something that, if it might sound kind of insane today to understand the way that technology works, but the thought was, can we use technology, the phones that we're carrying in our pockets, at that time they weren't really smartphones, they were just mobile phones, to actually enhance the way that we relate to our physical environment. Let's not make it about how we absorb ourselves in telephones and screens and other things, but let's actually see if there's a way to see and perceive our physical world differently. And the way that this worked was these stickers, shapes of yellow arrows, pointing out things in the urban environment, each one that had a unique code on it. People could then get these stickers off the internet. We'd mail them to anybody that would ask for them. And then they could put them pointing to things in the world that they wanted to draw attention to. If you wanted to kind of add a layer of information or surprise and leave a little message in a bottle in a way for others. And so people would send a text message with the code on the sticker to a telephone number, and then it would register that. When somebody else would see it, they'd send the code to the number and get the original message back. This one actually in the lower left was one of my favorites. It's in Times Square. And the message associated with it says, close your eyes and listen to the greatest urban symphony in the world. And it's basically a little prompt suggesting in kind of a surprising way to think differently and behave differently with your senses in a place that is typically thought of as primarily visual, to open yourself up to other ways of knowing and being. And another kind of project that I've been involved in, and I think is informed also by data and is informed by understanding the technology and the environment, but is maybe different than what people might often expect, is something that was called Mapping Main Street. So this is in the United States, and there's maybe somewhat of a similar phenomenon here in Canada. The notion of kind of Main Street is something somewhat mythological. In our 2008 election, there was a constant debate of Main Street versus Wall Street, and what became interesting to ask is, what is Main Street? And instead of sort of going to just the places and asking the people on the small towns that were sort of being envisioned, it said, let's actually just develop a data set that is literally every street that is named Main Street in the United States, and found out that there's 10,466 of them. And what if we actually created an opportunity for everybody around the country to contribute photos, videos, and stories about those streets, and what might we learn and what might we see? And what you found was that many main streets didn't have any buildings on them at all. There's main streets in the middle of fields. There's one of the longest streets in all of Los Angeles is Main Street, actually, passing through an incredibly diverse set of neighborhoods and places that you would never quite imagine is associated with Main Street when somebody brings that to mind. There's a Main Street that's a border crossing between Arizona and Mexico. The Main Street in Chattanooga at the time was at least primarily a prostitution strip. So it's, in this case, sort of an investigation of how data and technology might open up opportunities for us to reframe sort of mythologies and topics that we might not normally see in that way. And so that's sort of my own sort of experience of starting to investigate these things in a sort of period of time also with the internet and maybe mobile technology, where it's slightly more sort of expressive and experimental than it might be today. And this image that I just found this today is sort of looking up sort of burning down, boiling internet. And just as a sort of what is happening in our world on the web itself. And in effect, I think one of the challenges is that the web has become far less of a place of kind of creative exploration and experimentation, although it certainly continues to exist, and the means of communication have been far more narrowed. We are well familiar with this phenomena, that there's sort of a few particular sites that draw most of our attention, and that draw most of our attention on small screens. And I think the question that we have to ask is this the same trajectory that we might face in terms of cities as technology becomes more involved with the city? Well, does that by default mean that the future of the city will follow the same path as the way that the internet might have evolved? And I think that, Richard has sort of already asked this question about sort of the relationship of the soft and the hard, the kind of more rapid kind of evolutionary kind of purely software digital technologies, and then the questions of sort of the hard and the physical, and that have sort of move at a different time scale. And the other piece, of course, is sort of the embodied histories and institutional natures that exist in the city today, as it existed for centuries. Of course, it's a bit of a simplification, but in a way, the internet was a sort of much more sort of built from scratch phenomena of the modern period than the city that has existed for centuries and has long-standing institutional and political and policy structures to guide it. And I think the question then really becomes, what does it mean today in a city to engage with technology and place? And I think one of the great affordances and opportunities of cities is, in fact, the position that they have to build on that policy and to build on this sort of position in history that they bring to the discussion, to mix and combine technology and not sort of just be beholden to the notion that simply something new is inherently good and that simply something fast might be better. So some of the things that just to call out of what that kind of combination might be, and just some local references. I know, this King Street pilot is something probably many of you here are familiar with, you might have your own opinions about, but I think what's interesting and worth observing is it's a dramatic change to one of the major streets in the cities. It's a great example of the city taking on a challenge, an urban challenge, a challenge of the city. How can we get people to move on transit more quickly and create the opportunity for more people to move more easily, not just through private cars, but through other means? That's a big risk to change a major street in a city like Toronto. And the opportunity in a way to iterate and take a risk like that, in part comes from the ability to measure and communicate back the impact that an experiment like that has. And so this is that regular report that we see. And in fact, I think it would be very hard to say that whether it would be possible for the city to take a risk and create a pilot like this without the capacity to be able to tell a story back to the citizenry of the impact that that experiment is taking. And so I think that form of iteration, it's an example of being a little bit more, taking more risks and having that hard nature of a city change more easily in combination with technology to help understand that impact. Another space in this city that I've fallen in love with is the Bentway. And sort of a different way of looking at an urban environment, a space that might not have immediately jumped to everybody's mind as a wonderful future great public space. And the opportunities for embedding and integrating technology in moments of events and occurrences, in this case, the installation Waterlicht. And this is just a moment, actually, it's myself with my daughter and her little, she just has this owl that she carries around everywhere, and she wanted to throw it up into the light. And I think the power here and of these types of sort of experiences, and we see these more often with light, often with some form of interactivity, they might on the surface just seem sort of apolitical or silly or sort of no significance, but they're collective performances, I think, in public space that bring people together and interact in new ways. And I think that phenomena that we see increasingly in the rediscovery of the public realm as a place for those types of connections is significant and an important part of the city. There is, of course, as Richard already mentioned, in a way, the role in which technology might play in how services are delivered in places, and the role that the public sector in the city might play in improving the way that takes place. So a classic example in the United States is the work that has happened within the Obama administration, not so much carried through in recent years, in terms of improving the way that actually services for the VA community and veterans are provided, and actually just literally working with that community to build digital services that actually make it possible for them to have better lives. Things like 311 and a level of responsiveness. And back to Barcelona, an interesting example of where they've built their own technology for actually managing discussion and deliberation on discussions of what the city should be and become. And lastly, sort of the topic of adaptability, which I think is sort of an underlying opportunity when you wed technologies in the concert with physical materials. And this is a kind of image of a project in London that's starting to imagine a different type of street that has a much higher degree of responsiveness to people in different uses to potentially make the street safer and potentially much more of an interesting place to be in a way. And so it's not that this in and of itself would be the street of the future, but the notion that our streets, that sort of very classic sort of hard structure that underlies our environment, might have an ability to be more responsive and change and evolve with different circumstances, different needs, different challenges, I think is worth pursuing. And so I think it's in that regard, to come back, that you see sort of, it's not, there's somewhere in between, I think, the opportunities to know and to have some desire for control, I don't think is inherently in and of itself a bad thing. I think the question is sort of the management and sort of the politics of that control. But the information and knowledge that is possible, I think, is worth understanding. But I think it's much more important, in fact, to consider the uncertainty and the spontaneity and sort of the unpredictability that really make cities what they are. And to make that sort of, whether we call it smart, I would really just rather talk about cities and acknowledge that cities have for centuries involved technology, and technologies today are a part of our cities. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jesse. On to our next Jesse, Jesse LeCavalier. As I might have mentioned, Jesse is a new professor here at the faculty, and he's an award-winning author, researcher, and designer whose work explores the architectural and urban implications of the contemporary logistics industry. Among other things, his work explores the impact of the marketplaces, what I would call the marketplace's new architecture and urbanism, driven by entities such as Walmart and Amazon, and the effects they have on the design of cities. So, and this is, of course, something he explored in depth in his recent book, The Rule of Logistics, Walmart, and the Architecture of Fulfillment. So, Jesse, take it away.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Richard, for the invitation and the chance to be here tonight, but also to be here in general. It's very, it's super exciting to be able to join join this place, and both Daniel's and then also the university, which is for me a really exciting, super exciting opportunity, but also in the context of this smart cities debate discussion. There's, as Richard mentioned, lots of really important work being done around this topic, so it's meaningful to be part of this effort tonight and tomorrow to try to contribute to this discussion. So what I'd like to talk about tonight, and it's interesting to be coming into an event like this sort of without much coordination across the other speakers, that there are these sort of resonances that will be nice to try to discuss. But we didn't really coordinate these talks, so part of it is sort of an interest, is a way to see what we're all kind of looking at without consulting each other. So what I'd like to talk about tonight is how the built environment runs a risk of being increasingly overdetermined by the technical systems that we were just hearing about, and then constrained by economic performance criteria. In other words, I'm interested in how to deal with this issue where the urban becomes a problem of management rather than a problem of design. And I think the ability to understand the dynamics that lead to that better will help us to subsequently imagine other ways out of that. And so talking about the sort of so-called smart city, for me, tonight at least we'll talk about it from the position more of the kind of collateral actors who are not necessarily the municipalities or the organizations who are developing smart city technology, but the companies and the other sort of actors and agents and stakeholders in the city who are not sort of specifically setting out to make the city smarter or more intelligent or more responsive, but the related industries who, by pursuing their own interests, are impacting the city in interesting and significant and problematic ways. And underpinning this is a shift from the kind of mechanized city and the industrialized city to the increasingly automated and, I would say, logistical city. So to enter into this, I'd like to start with a short clip from the 2008, you might call it a 2008 fiasco, Eagle Eye. This is a film Roger Ebert described as not just an assault on intelligence, but an assault on consciousness. And I'd like to nonetheless show you a clip from it because it's, for me, it's an important way to kind of get a glimpse into the worlds a little bit of this smart city world, because it shows the relationship between humans and mechanized mechanical systems of vision, systems of management as they're confronted. So basically what you're seeing here are the heroes are being chased by an FBI agent, and they're being helped in their escape by a mysterious computer who's telling them, like this, take gate 1C, as they're trying to evade their pursuer, and this leads them into the logistical heart of the airport, the luggage sorting area.
So people recognize it.
I'll spare you the rest of it. But I like this drawn out scene because it talks about the habits of mind that I think are embodied in these logistical systems, and you see it especially when the humans are passed through the scanner. And I think, I mean, even though of course this is a product of Hollywood, I think it does speak to the way that the logistical system is trained to see a certain thing and then can only see that thing. So a scanner designed to see boxes will only see boxes, and even here the humans who are being scanned through that are read as parcels to be managed. You can see there's no barcode, but nonetheless these things are these things become sort of treated as logistical entities to be then redirected. So ultimately, our heroes escape because the so-called shoe sorter pushes Billy Bob Thornton off onto the other conveyor belt, and they're able to kind of move on. But I think for me, what this is significant about is, on one hand, the kind of incompatibilities that we're increasingly faced with as we encounter a world of machines that we have created, but that we don't necessarily know how to communicate with. And this world of total control enabled by a computational vision and intelligence is, of course, one of the tropes of the smart city discussion. And so this film is actually based on, loosely, based on an Asimov short story called All the Troubles in the World from 1959. So minor spoiler alerts here, but it's still worth reading even if you know how it ends. The story centers on a supercomputer called Multivac and a threat to its livelihood. And in the story, this is the introduction quote: "The greatest industry on Earth is centered about Multivac, a giant computer that had grown in 50 years until its various ramifications had filled Washington, D.C. to the suburbs and had reached out tendrils into every city and town on Earth. Multivac directed Earth's economy and helped Earth's science. Most important of all, it was the central clearinghouse of all known facts about each individual human on Earth." So the protagonists of the story uncover a plot to destroy the computer, only to discover that it is Multivac itself attempting to orchestrate its own destruction. On the screen behind me, these are some images of Facebook and Google data centers. So baffled by such a discovery, one of the managers, one of the heroes of the story, realizes the tremendous burden that this effectively global AI has been placed under because of humans' demands upon it. He says, "Oh my God, Multivac is freaking out because it bears, quote, all the troubles of the world on its shoulders, and it's tired." The story ends by the two protagonists asking the computer, "Multivac, what do you yourself want more than anything else?" After a dramatic pause, the computer answers, "I want to die." So this story of a suicidal computer, I think for me, is not so much about the presence, the prescience of the story, but rather for the way that it illuminates an aspect of this implication of total management and control. And so in Multivac's case, maybe it just needed a way to unwind, and maybe all of this smartness doesn't mean you actually know how to have a good time or actually to be spontaneous. And I think this is one of these tendencies of the technologically infused city that we need to guard against. And this is what Jesse was also just talking about, the kind of balance between the managerial city and the spontaneity, the city of spontaneity and irrationality. And so I think that's one of the things to be aware of. The other, I think, or another, is to remain vigilant that these, as Richard mentioned, this is an industry. So this is not necessarily always sort of municipal beneficial municipal actors. Sometimes these are paths disguised as forms of market creation. So some of the research I've done actually with Orit has been about the way that something like Songdo was developed in close collaboration with Cisco, and the realization that smart cities will be great for data providers because they will need ever more bandwidth and it will offer ever more monetizable attention. And so a recent report estimated that almost 40 billion American dollars of investment is due to be made in the field of smart cities, compared with a total of just 8 billion in 2010. So basically almost like a quintupling of investment in this. And so I think it's about part of this this question of the role that irrationality plays. And so I think as designers, planners, artists, urban designers, architects, one of our tasks is to figure out how to make sure the city, whatever we sort of want to see the city as, remains, keeps the sort of flattening tendencies of rationalizing management at bay. So working, I think, as we always have done in a way to try to to deal with the fact that this technology has always been part of the city, but to think about how it can become something that will fuel or stimulate imaginative leaps and creative acts of inhabitation, to do, I think, what Saskia Sassen, I think, has identified in a really nice way, to keep the city complex and incomplete. Linked to that, I think, is working against finding alternatives to convenience, because there's an insidiousness to convenience, there's a temptation of convenience that can lead to this kind of overdetermined world. And so I think by not sort of easily falling into the category, by maybe resisting the idea of calling these things smart, as we've heard so far already tonight, to talk about the role that technology plays in cities, I think that becomes a much more productive way to think of the question, because what we start to increasingly to talk about are machines communicating with other machines, and then we happen to be around, and we happen to be dealing with them. And it starts to get weird, I think, when these machines start communicating with each other and start producing their own imagination or their own imagery or their own logic. So on the screen behind me, this is a project from the artist Trevor Paglen. This is a series of what he calls hallucinations, where through antagonistic processes vary to sort of programs will try to persuade the other that this is an image of the thing that it's trying to produce, and it generates these kind of hallucinogenic, kind of dreamlike images about familiar things that somehow you can't quite put your finger on them. So I think that as the smart city becomes more and more capable of producing realities, I think it's useful to start looking at more carefully at one of these examples. And so, which is what I'd like to do with the remaining bit of my time here, and that's to look at how one aspect of the logistical city is doing this thing, this kind of reorganization. In fact, without us maybe totally being aware of what is happening. And so this has to do with a company you have probably heard of called Amazon. Amazon has developed, in conjunction with an organization called Kiva Systems, they have developed quite a radical and I think profound way of thinking about space and organization through the development of this automated guided vehicle system. And the difference between most of these, this is basically for their warehousing processes. What most automated systems would do is have fixed things following fixed paths. What Amazon and Kiva has figured out is that they don't need to follow a fixed path. They can actually move much more like particles. And this is the drawing from the patent system that explains how this would work. And Amazon was so persuaded by this, they spent almost $800 million on the company, and now it's become the cornerstone of Amazon robotics. And so the way that it works very quickly, the small orange bots, they lift these shelves off of the floor, and they move them to a station where someone can then pick the order and then send it on to be shipped. And in order to have an item delivered for picking, a request is sent to all of the robotic drive units on the floor. And then according to the language of the patents, quote, the mobile drive units respond to the order request with bids that represent the amount of time each mobile drive unit calculates it would take to deliver the requested item. And in other words, who's closest? And then the winning bid then delivers its charge to the awaiting station. Once the items have been picked, the RDU brings the shelf back, but not to its original position. And then this is where it gets weird, I think, because, and this is what's novel about this. It doesn't go back to where it came from. It goes back to wherever is conveniently available. So imagine like the library. I mean, this happens in libraries too, but if you go to take a book off the library shelf, you have to put it back in the place that it came from, because that's how we find it, but because we have a sort of certain way of ordering that. But through the machine language, the machine logic doesn't require that. And so basically what's happening is the warehouse is reconfiguring itself constantly. And so one of the breakthroughs here with Kiva was to granularize the system to make storage and inventory the same thing, and to make storage mobile. Storage in the context of these things was often imagined to be a fixed element. In some cases, the racks are even actually part of the structure, which we would say are actually part of the building. So in these cases, in Kiva's system, the storage becomes the architecture itself. It's fixed in place, and then the Kiva undoes this by making a much more nimble architecture, by not insisting that storage elements remain static, and by animating them with a certain kind of intelligence. Instead of machine buildings populated with robot-like humans, which is maybe a kind of familiar trope, this is a machine landscape full of building-like robots. And the Kiva systems, their form of internal communication creates an overall organization in which the racks with frequently requested items drift closer to the packing station. And the inventor of this, they describe this using the language of emergence and swarm behavior, which if you think back to maybe the fascination with this in the mid-2000s around making buildings that are cities that looked like swarms, here actually is a building for behaving in an emergent way. And I think this is significant because this is what this is showing us. What you see on the screen is a dynamic set of elements controlled by simple local feedback, but creating this shifting whole whose content for us as humans remains basically illegible. So these buildings provoke, I think, a kind of crisis of legibility, and that we can't understand the behavior of the machines even though we created the instructions that guide them. So when observing the RDUs in action, one is tempted to assign a kind of intelligence to these machines because they seem to operate with such unpredictable purpose, and which for me reminds me of the 1984 study from Valentino Bradenberg about these so-called, it's a thought experiment about these vehicles, and basically through very kind of simple stimulus structures, they take on certain kind of behavior. So some seem aggressive, some seem cowardly, some seem affectionate, but really what's happening is they're just responding to a stimulus. So the apparent autonomy of the Amazon robotics automated fulfillment center suggests, if not creates, a certain sense of historical inevitability. The how of the mechanism supersedes the why, and the spectacles of autonomous fulfillment landscape justify the system that they propagate. In other words, the underlying assumptions and values about the consumer society on which Amazon is built become more and more normalized through a set of technologies that create greater and greater distance between action and consequences. In the case of Amazon, participation in the consumer process is rendered remote and instantaneous. We can track the progress of our items, a process that reduces the totally immense efforts and complexities of the supply chain into a series of checkpoints. If we were to try to do more than haphazardly monitor the process of order fulfillment, our frustration would continue because of the unintelligibility of the landscape itself. A wilderness of machines of our own making that, while not autonomous, maintains a kind of diffuse momentum of propagation. So like electrification, fulfillment, I think, is on the way to becoming increasingly a new utility. It's increasingly thought of as one of these sort of features of the smart city and this new expectation of contemporary life. And I think, like electrification, it's also changing us in the process. So the degree to which we collectively depend on these systems then becomes a key question. So in the context of an increasingly technomorphic landscape, companies like Amazon thrive if we're isolated as individual consuming subjects. But in isolation, as Langdon Winner has described, seemingly valid excuses can be manufactured wholesale for anyone situated in the network. Thus, the very notion of moral agency begins to dissolve. So if we accept that automation has a technological momentum that will work to shape the built environment to its own expedient ends, then rather than stepping aside to let technology run its course, there's an opportunity to treat this as an urban and architectural issue, at least a spatial one, if nothing else. So the city's always been negotiating and absorbing new technologies. I think our challenge now is to look for ways to meet this with a kind of seductive response and to proliferate inventions that can generate modes of practice that see these problems of logistics and automation as actually design problems, not as management problems. Thank you.
And our last formal speaker for this evening, Michael Sorkin. Michael's a venerated architecture critic, author, editor, and designer. He is the principal and founder of Michael Sorkin Studio and the president and founder of Terraform, a nonprofit institute dedicated to research into just and sustainable urbanism. And he's co-president of the Forum and an Institute for Urban Design, and also, on top of all these things, a distinguished professor of architecture at the City College in New York. Michael was recently awarded the American Institute of Architects 2019 Collaborative Achievement Award for his work, quote, inspiring countless architects and planners in their pursuit of a more just and sustainable communities. As the AIA jury wrote, his roles of provocative author, publisher, and teacher have made him a definitive conscience to the profession. Now, I am old enough to have first read him as the architecture critic of the Village Voice. He was then, and still is, one of the few critics in our field, I would say, that's willing to tell it like it is. And we were both visiting professors many years ago at Washington University, where I learned a lot from Michael, so I'm very glad to have him tonight.
Thank you. Thanks, Richard. So there is a term of art in the outdoor theater that is spoken when the director espies dark clouds gathering on the horizon and knows that the duration of the performance is about to be limited, and whispers to the actors, "Rain speed," at which point they speak their lines with incredible acceleration. I have a text that is a little bit long,
so relax.
So I'm going to read like crazy, huh? The smart city is the utopia neoliberalism has been waiting for. Beneath the palaver about responsiveness, efficiency, convenience, connectivity, and the liberatory vectors of tech lies the monetization of the commons, rolled out under the anodyne slogan, public-private partnership. Democracy, of course, is itself a system for drawing this line between mine, ours, and theirs, and it adjudicates how rights, responsibilities, and resources are shared, and founds the structures of representation and power that actually assign them. The fundamental question is who decides? Who's the demos? There's surely a big political difference between the organizational diagram for a municipal planning process that begins with the mayor or some citizen initiative, is articulated by the Department of City Planning and other municipal agencies in consultation with residents, is vetted by a community board or its equivalent, and finally approved by the city council, all answerable to the electoral process. On the other hand, a chain of command and control that begins with Alphabet Incorporated, descends to its creature Google, thence to its spawn Sidewalk Labs, and on to implementation by captive creatures like CityBridge, is a fundamentally different story. The particular case I'm thinking of, however, is not the impending Googlification of Toronto, but a more distilled and accelerated example in New York City. The seemingly overnight erection of 1,800 9.5-foot-high digital stellae on the sidewalks of the city, via that self-same chain of command that is looking to install them in cities around the world, including Toronto. These intrusions are the outcome of a 2014 deal between the de Blasio administration and a corporation run by an interlocking directorate controlled by Dan Doctoroff. Very good looking. Your own wannabe Baron Haussmann, and Exhibit A in the lucrative possibilities of the revolving government real estate, high-tech, high-finance door, rising from Lehman Brothers to his own hedge fund, to Bloomberg's deputy mayor for development, to CEO of Bloomberg LP, to the head of Sidewalk Labs. Doctoroff has not been shy about the convenient and economical evasions of noisome forms of public process. In describing plans to corner the city building market, Doctoroff declared that one key element is that Sidewalk would be seeking autonomy from many city regulations so it could build without constraints. The rationale for this deal was to acquire a high-tech replacement for our decrepit system of public telephones, and the kiosks offer free calls, Wi-Fi connection, USB charging ports. Not unsurprisingly, these appliances don't represent a selfless act of civic generosity on the part of the corporations behind them, but, as Link NYC's peppy PR unabashedly declares, they're free because advertising pays for them. And the obvious reason for their enormity is to house 55-inch high-def screens, which glaringly add to the 24/7 delirium of incitements to consume that increasingly dominate our sidewalks, arguably the most vital and valuable component of our public realm. I can't specifically unpack the locational algorithm for these monstrosities. which are mainly concentrated in Manhattan, but the limited 150-foot range of their Wi-Fi coverage demands that they be spaced at intervals of less than 300 feet to enable them to effectively perform their public service. The standard Manhattan block is 264 by 900 feet. You do the math. This swap of private interest for some nominal public benefit has been baked into the way New York has been doing business for many years. Our bus shelters are generously funded by enormous illuminated advertisements, and of course, both the subways and their stations are festooned with paper versions. More, the Link NYC kiosks are effectively miniature iterations of the air rights deals refined during our pre-digital days, in which the swap of one public good, the penetration of light and air to the street, a view of the sky, manageable density, a park without a condominium in the middle of it, was exchanged for what was purportedly another public good, the preservation of a theater, a tiny plaza, more tax revenue, or in the current incarnation, a certain number of affordable housing units. Whatever the actual currency of the exchange, however, the deal can never come out even Steven. What would be the point for private investors? And this occupation of yet more of our crowded sidewalks can only be seen as a huge privatization of the commons and a further surrender of our right to the city. Speaking of Henri Lefebvre. While this is structurally invidious, it isn't particularly smart. The primitive familiarity and Times Square luminosity of those glowing come-ons flashing in your face 24/7 is a Trojan horse for the main purpose and profitability of these agents, surveillance. To log on, just let us know your email address. The gotcha moment. Facial recognition kicks in to confirm, perhaps another sensor gives you a sniff, and a million databases begin to conspire. The robot network can now follow you everywhere. Your movements betray you. Did you read the story in the Times about the dozens of shadowy companies that hoover up locational data from all our cell phones? Whoa, I'm way behind here. Think back. Map millions of individual routes with an accuracy measurable in feet and individually plotted as many as 14,000 times a day, draw marketing or policing inferences and sell them to the highest bidder, reviewing the records of a woman who volunteered to allow the paper to examine her easily identified path by doing little more than entering the coordinates of her suburban home and job. It quickly identified visits to her ex-boyfriend, her therapist, Planned Parenthood, and Weight Watchers. These unbridled algorithms feed on your position, routing, appearance, and associations to classify your behaviors, affinities, thoughts, and habits of consumption and sort them into lines of code that drive ads onto your screens. Smart bombs aimed directly at our micro-demographics, even our idiosyncrasies. What can we sell that aging, wine-loving, downtown, condo-owning, creative, married, slightly overweight white guy today? Link NYC is the watchtower of the deep neoliberal state, physically marking its territory and virtually mapping ours within it. Each is topped by 3 cameras, up high for clear sight lines, and each conceals an additional 30 sensors of mysterious capacity. Dr. Ufpul's no punches about what he's up to. In a talk at the Yale Club in 2016, he proclaimed, "In effect, what we're doing is replicating the digital experience in physical space. So ubiquitous connectivity, incredible computing power, including artificial intelligence and machine learning, the ability to display data, sensing, including cameras and location data, as well as other kinds of specialized sensors, we fund it all through a very novel advertising model. We can actually then target ads to people in proximity, and then obviously over time track them through things like beacons and location services, as well as their browsing activities." What more succinct definition of the moving line between utility and slavery? In her new book, Shoshana Zuboff has called this instrumentality surveillance capitalism, which she defines as a new economic order that claims human experience as free raw material for hidden commercial practices of extraction, prediction, and sales. A parasitic economic logic in which the production of goods and services is subordinated to a new global architecture of behavioral modification and a rogue mutation of capitalism marked by concentrations of wealth, knowledge, and power unprecedented in human history. While I don't entirely subscribe to the description of this mutation as rogue, it is clear that the objective of the smart neoliberal surveillance city is to monetize both space and behavior with maximum precision. What follows from the monetization of your gaze, your thoughts, your movements, your associations, your body? What is the character of daily life in the smart city? The pop-up ads for flights to Portugal that follow your Googling Alvaro Siza is simply the tip of the iceberg, although the sight of every citizen in the elevator or subway cathected to their little screen does go deeper. The smart city's core agenda is to shift every aspect of the public realm into private hands, to effectively create a fee-for-service city. Where might this lead? Perhaps before long, simply crossing the street will cause your Apple Pay to dock you half a cent user's charge to maintain this vital infrastructure, an eventuality not a million miles from the increasing use of congestion pricing and with elements of the same logic. In that system, traffic is reduced by discouraging drivers who cannot afford the price and are zoned out according to rings of privilege. The smart city likewise walls us into an infinity of personalized, credit-rated, compartmentalized fiefs. Link NYC is another collection point in a network to snatch your data and to compile you, to digitize you. The smart city demands a quantifiable subject, universal not in the mathematically egalitarian modernist sense, but camouflaged with fake nuance based entirely on our malleable patterns of getting and spending. And so begins the big sort. Big data gives Big Brother the capacity to micromanage, to generate highly bespoke forms of address. The quantum of the quantifiable can be tiny, opening the door to the micro-monetization of everyday life. This is the core mechanism of the smart city, an accelerated social stratification that operates both at the micro scale of our intimate, customized, completely tracked and susceptible transactions, Whole Foods will notice if I go vegan, and at the hyperscale, as those pennies rush upwards to line the pockets of Sergey Brin, Larry Page, or Mark Zuckerberg, arguably the most efficiently evil person on the planet. It's absolutely vital that we fear the smart city foremost as an overwhelming threat to our much-assailed right to privacy. But this panoptic anxiety is not exactly new, even if the technologies of surveillance, analysis, and coercion have become exponentially more sophisticated. No need to further rehearse this, save perhaps to note that this totalitarian voyeurism comes in several guises. If Google primarily wants an array of softly coercive means to sell your data to corporations that want to sell you stuff, the Chinese government uses the same kinds of information to assign each citizen a social credit score, an obedience quotient that can determine whether your kid gets into school, where you're allowed to live, and whether you get that promotion at Qualcomm. The Russians, for their part, want to steal elections. And we're deeply implicated too. A swelling cohort of academics at our very own schools run interference by spending their grant money to develop a highly computational, objective urban pseudoscience, a truly artificial intelligence. Hiding behind the authentically useful contributions data technology might make, conserving energy, finding leaks in the sewer, they roll out their reams of obscurantist quantification as if data and its gathering could ever be neutral. However, those ubiquitous CCTV cameras and sensor arrays that populate the city, not to mention the cookies that stuff our digital larders, do not merely threaten our freedom of association, speech, thought, and the more and more battered autonomy of our subjectivity, but recast the very nature of urban space as a simultaneously social and physical construct. If the smart city knows where you are, wherever you are, the particularity of place as a merged expression of sight and sensation, of memory and masonry, is annihilated by a supplanting virtuality that instrumentalizes character simply as an incitement to order another pumpkin spice latte. In the smart city, place is displaced and replaced by location. Corporate and governmental authorities care only for your coordinates. Everywhere is equivalent as long as everyone has a device, and everyone soon will. Under this citizenship as marketing regime, a megacity is equivalent to a cabin in the woods, only with a higher concentration of opportunities to troll and to beam ads at passersby in the street, more literal points of sale, more opportunities to affirm the ultimate essentialism of the neoliberal subject, a compendium of manipulated tendencies to buy. Just as genetic engineering is discovering how to use recombinant DNA, both to defeat disease and to create freakish designer babies, so our cities are becoming increasingly susceptible to the splicings of creative geography, eviscerating the meaning of both locality and location, and opening a terrain of free juxtaposition and promiscuous place, an intermediate condition that rehearses us for the day when the chip's actually in our brains and VR truly is the world, and you simply are where you are, wherever you are. In the Internet of Things, we're all just wet appliances with credit lines, disembodied receptacles for American Express cards. That's the nightmare. See you in Disneyland version, at any rate. I date myself, but does anybody remember that late 60s TV show, The Prisoner, starring the great Patrick McGoohan? He's being held for some unspecified crime against the state in the adorably ersatz village of Portmeirion in Wales, and his incarceration, as long as he doesn't attempt to escape, is a cartoon holiday, all charm, straw boaters, and high tea. Although he and his fellow prisoners are identified not by name, but by number. Alienation 101. Despite the town's appearance of porosity and the inviting sea, there's no escape from the all-sighted guardians who dispatch big bouncing balloon drones to capture any who try to flee. Here, then, is a prescient image of urban smartness. Without doubt, Google Toronto will be charming, sustainable, and convenient, a compilation of non-threatening best design practices, lead ratings and all. But beware. Handing a slice of town over to Google is far different than selling development rights to Olympia and York or Donald Trump. Their game, however greedy and corrupt, is simply real estate. For Google, city building, like the phony Kumbaya world community hyped by Facebook, is a means to the real objective: data capture, manipulation, and weaponizing to rob you of your cash and, along the way, your freedom. Fuck these stupid cities. Let's think about wise ones. Oh, and now a word from our sponsor. I've become a nonprofit book publisher. Please buy one. Including the forthcoming... Thank you.
We're going back on stage. We're going to drink some water and argue. Do you think you could pull up Jesse's presentation and find that last slide with all the people under the sheet?
Oh, I have to get it. It's on my machine.
Okay. Could you do that?
I'd love to.
Just want to have that as our... I'm going to break up the...
Michael, are you sure you don't want to sit next to me?
I'm sorry?
Are you sure you don't want to sit next to me?
Go ahead.
Something to sit on the right side. Yeah.
Where to begin? I'm gonna start with a funny anecdote or a story that is linked to some of the things you guys have shown. First, more recent one from more recently. A friend of mine lives on 23rd Street in New York, and someone was producing a film. That was set, I believe, in the 1940s, so they had to transform the street to look like the 1940s. So they took all of the Link New York kiosks and they just built phone booths around them in order to kind of recreate this landscape, which sort of brings to mind, it raises the question what the difference is between these things and a phone booth. And we link that to another kind of related story. Michael, you brought this up. About a little bit more than a dozen years ago, I was asked to be an expert witness in a court case also in New York, where following the city selling to, I think the company Samusa, which is it's a Spanish company, the city of New York put out a bid, like many cities did, I think it happened here too, to sell the rights to build bus shelters, telephone booths, and news kiosks. So the companies would build them at their expense for the right to have advertising on that infrastructure in the city. So the city did this, rolled all of these out, even though, by the way, at that point, no one was using phone booths except for vagrants and drug dealers, but they were a good kind of hoist for the advertising. So soon after that, a very shrewd entrepreneur realized that his company could also hoist advertising in the city that would be very similar to the advertising on the kiosks and on the bus shelters, which was illuminated like it is in this one, slightly previous technology. But he was putting it on sort of available party walls and other things in open parking lots. And so the city sued him. And in this court case, the city tried to make the case that where all the kiosks and the bus shelters and the phone booths was the public realm, and where the other advertising was not. And so I actually testified on behalf of the private industry, because basically there was zero difference between the deployment of advertising in the private realm and what they were calling the public realm. And the defense the city had of selling the public space for advertising was that it was just like, it was a long history that it existed in Paris, but it turns out that is not the way that advertising was done in New York City. And the reason I bring this up is when I got involved in this case, I realized, I started to ask how, since the state, in this case, or the government, the city, had sold these rights, who is it that's actually going to be the entity that is going to maintain the, let's say, the demos or the civic good that you're arguing for, Michael, right? Because I think the ability of the city governments to, or the willingness for them to actually take these risks or to take on the financial and political project of maintaining these shared areas, I think, has been stripped out. So, who's the good guy? A good girl?
You asking me?
Or anyone on the panel. I think this is the. I mean, to start where you ended, we can get into some of these other issues, but this question of the liberalization of the economy and the fact that the city is being built by private companies. I mean, it's a fact, right?
It's a relatively recent fact,
right.
The kind of omega point of this degeneration is Trump, and his values. We just elected somebody in the Bronx called Alexandra Olympiakopoulos, who's like the hot congressperson, 29 years old, And she is proposing to raise the marginal tax rate to
Yes.
90%,
Yes.
as it was during the days of Dwight D. Eisenhower,
Right.
that raving communist. My point is a simple one. I think that the public should be and is responsible for the maintenance of the public realm.
Right.
And this idea that it has to be franchised, that every increment of improvement to the public realm has to be transactional and profit-driven. What a sorry place to arrive at.
Yeah. So, Jesse, what's your understanding of the role of because you've been in the middle of all this. So, what is your understanding of the role of government in producing the city, or the evolving role?
So I think it's, these are not uncomplicated questions, but certainly very, very important ones. And I guess, speaking personally, I would certainly say, and I think many people that I work with have, longstanding commitment and strong belief in the importance of the public sector and of government, and the important role of government in sort of representing democratic values and carrying those out in the construction of our cities. And I think there's the fundamental question that, there's almost a kind of fundamental philosophical political debate around sort of some sort of dimensions of pragmatism and sort of acknowledging a kind of existing condition versus a certain kind of aspiration towards a sort of recalibration of our commons and sort of the role of the way that we might tax and we might contribute to our public goods. And I think the question of it's not necessarily a sort of either or. I think that there's a kind of evolving trajectory, and I think we do see. I recently moved from New York and, follow sort of local politics in a somebody like you're speaking about. And I think these are certainly, exciting prospects for me personally. And I would say that to the degree that we can envision a future where the public sector, and I mentioned Francesca Bria in the city of Barcelona, which I think has been, frankly, very pioneering. And it's not purely a financial piece. It's a sort of the structuring of a conversation and the role the public sector plays in that. And I think, I certainly will not agree with sort of the illustration and sort of the what you have suggested as the underlying intent of the work here. I think it is far more complex, and the relationship of the city of Toronto and the relationship of the public sector and their influence on and sort of our own commitment to the public policy objectives is significant. So I could say a lot, but I think that the public good is ultimately what cities are built around, and we need to pay attention to that. And cities that have never exclusively been driven by a sort of government, the relationship of private interest has always been a part of them, and it's different ways in which that is explored.
So, Orit, I think your presentation raises the question, what the nature of kind of human subject is in these conceptions of smartness, and also in the building of the city, or in conceptions of the city, whether understanding the kinds of, let's say, ecological and environmental challenges we're facing, whether it is just the human subject that should be considered in these questions, right? Because there's plant life, there's animals, there's a whole other way of thinking about the making of the world.
Well, one way to think about that is in relation to the discussion we just had, which, for starters, I mean, that may be true of New York, but around most of the world, it hasn't always been a public, like if you take different cases of urban development and who does it and how infrastructure happens, it's not, there are many different combinations and organizations, and public-private is not a very clear or sometimes even an existing thing. And secondly, there's sort of a question of both trying to understand how we think about this future in a mode that's more diverse, which is to say, I don't love what corporations want in terms of their extractive thing, but I don't cry about how great the nation state has always been to everybody. Dwight D. Eisenhower, great feminist. So in trying to be both neither nostalgic and at the same simultaneously trying to figure out how do we, I think the real question at stake in what I tried to say is how do we diversify our understandings of economy, of value, of practice in a way that might actually both activate the things that these technologies can do, the new modes of visualization, relationships to environment, relationship to other, rethinking difference, and at the same time recognize the violence that's happening all the time. And so that just kind of says, okay, it's complicated, but I think we need to keep, I hate saying like, let's keep it complicated, but let's also try to generate vocabularies because we're coming down in ways that sometimes don't work, and don't work very well in a lot of places in the world where I've worked. Like, I don't really understand in Kolkata how these concepts are going to operate. The state doesn't defend anybody. Like whatever, and like who's the public? Who are these public people? I mean, there's and how do we pluralize that public? You know, I mean, that's a real issue because lots of people have not historically constituted part of the public.
Yeah, without question, we have to talk about multiple publics. But my argument is essentially that this private transaction, this deal making, has the effect, not just in New York City, of, in general, attenuating inequality. So, one constantly reads the story about the kids who go to the upper middle class school getting great enrichment because their parents can pony up for additional books and field trips, while the kids in the poor neighborhood, because of both the absence of that private capacity and the insistence that private capacity is the only route to enrichment, this is deeply problematic. I have no great love for the nation state, but I do note that there's a lot of discussion about localism nowadays, and certainly in an era in which nation states are increasingly incompetent and multinational corporations are increasingly malevolent, smaller increments of governance, accountancy, and democracy, and something we should talk about. We talk about neighborhoods, for example.
And I think, just to follow, I think this also links a bit to the other Jesse's talk, in the sense of, might it help us to break out from these general discussions that have preoccupied urbanism until now to get to the tactics, the specificities, like how these technologies are deployed, what do they do, and also what are the terms by which we're imagining their future? Like, I invoked this group that runs a lab called Indigenous Futures because they're interested in both embracing technology but attempting to create different models that would actually force designers and engineers to rethink what intelligence is. So when I bring in this discussion about, I don't want artificiality anymore because that assumes there's some intelligence out there that these machines have to replicate. Or when we use terms like optimization, resilience, I mean, these are terms that really have to be taken apart, reopened, reimagined, or just destroyed. I mean, I have some real questions. I think that's sort of what you were getting at, but also taken or maybe tactically dealt with through an examination of the specifics of these algorithms, which I know.
Well, yeah, I like what you were saying earlier also about the need for new vocabularies and the sorry, just turn it off.
Is he on?
Green light's off, but I can shout. I like what you were saying, Orit, about new vocabularies because it was. I'm still wireless, but I'm now less mobile. The idea of the new vocabularies and the sort of need for looking at the language and how the language. I mean, I think the language around the smart city discourse is also insidious because it packages things really neatly. So I think I think what you were saying about the search for new or just an expanded way of talking to it and looking more carefully at what we've inherited. I think that, for me, also resonates around recognizing that the sort of modes of thought that led us here aren't necessarily going to be the ones that will take us out of it. And so I think that's where we're trying to see, to try to understand what the current versions are. But I think that it's also linked, I think, to the notion of how imagination gets facilitated and produced. And so how do we sort of work against a kind of transactional mode of urban use when it's the only model that's sort of presented. So I think the challenge of finding ways to cultivate an imagination that says there is value in this other sort of form of investment, even if it's not direct, even if it isn't about a kind of one-to-one return on your own personal investment in your service, and that the sort of larger willingness to invest is something that I think is about cultivating a faith in that, but it's difficult when it's so systematically eroded.
I guess I'm curious to ask Michael a question, and others, but I think one of the questions or things that I've observed, and I think many have, one of the factors, there's the role of kind of the rise of the tech industry, and we look at that significantly in sort of a narrative here about cities. But I think in general, there's a much broader kind of transformation of the attraction of cities for economy, broadly defined, and people in a way to intensify and find connection in dense urban areas. That's an undeniable trend in terms of North American cities, especially in terms of people's desire to be in denser environments than they might have in the past. And the role that has in terms of the significance of the public realm, the role of public spaces, and whether or not, in the equity questions associated with that, and in particular the kind of pluralities, and whether or not we believe, are we seeing in the intensification of urbanism a greater plurality of people active in public space, or are we seeing a kind of decrease in the sort of collective presence in public space? Because I don't think it's actually set aside whether or not there's a link chaos there or not. The question of who's on the street in cities, I think, is really an intriguing one.
Well, but not so perplexing. If you map the rent rates in New York City over the last 15 years, you will see the increasing displacement of people of low income. So, this Richard Florida idea that this creative class is going to be sucked into the having a Starbucks within 150 feet is the apogee of civilization. This is creating cities of great uniformity that are inhospitable to the poor. And factories of inequality. It's deeply problematic. Obviously, city. I'm an urbanist. Cities are sociability and juxtaposition engines, and have been, since the year Gimmel. But I think you need to look a little, in a slightly more nuanced way, at the nature of the public space, and it isn't simply the space. It's hospitality to these diverse publics. If that's a value that you cherish.
I think, I tried to frame this event and tomorrow's event around this question of the difference between the historical trajectories of, let's say, what I call it, the softer technologies of digital technologies in the city, because you could say that, it's a reality that these new forms of social media and new digital forms of communication have accelerated very quickly, but they have not matured as around issues of how you govern them, et cetera. Whereas we've pointed out that cities have been around for millennia, and they have matured in a way as a kind of system. But I think where the rubber hits the road here, and why I wanted to have this illustration up, is if everyone's collected in a public space, but they're all on their smartphone, what kind of civic space is that, right? They're all on their smartphone somewhere else, or plugged into something, and that's why you chose this image, because it in a way it's from the some sort of happening in the 60s, yeah. And many of the happenings did anticipate these kinds of questions about, how we become isolated from one another, even when we're together through certain kinds of subjectivity. So, this I think is one of the big questions.
Well, it's a very big. I mean, the relationship of citizenship to embodiment.
Right.
That's another conference.
Yes.
Well, I mean, maybe I would add about the Leisure Clark piece. I mean, I think for me it was about the Leisure Papek. Right, this sort of further. So this is just a detail of a much larger thing, and everyone is sort of moving, but connected to through this sheet. And I do like it because there's an ambiguity to it. I think that there's both the kind of individual isolation, but then there is a kind of tetheredness where you have to move together. So everyone wants to go in a different direction. It doesn't. You can't get anywhere. But because I do think, I mean, kind of along the lines of what Orit is saying, I think that there's multiple ways of being together beyond just being physically proximate, and I think those things can be enabled by all sorts of these developments. And so I think that figuring out how we continue to sort of update how we understand what it means to be participating as citizens, but also to be understanding how we also then tend to the space of the city as the stewards of it, while these technologies continue to push forward. And so, I mean, I guess when I think about as I was trying to say in the presentation, the notion that somehow it's not hard to imagine fulfillment as a thing that we would all expect. I think for me, it's been useful to think about the period of the cities where it wasn't expected that you had all these holes in your walls with wires attached to them, or you didn't have all these lights in your buildings, or you didn't have all this water that you could just turn on and off. And I think the way that infrastructure finds its way into daily life, I think, is something that has always been a process of transformation. And I think we all could have mentioned this in some way or another, that technology is fundamentally part of the city. So apropos of a conversation about so-called smartness, or about the kind of intensifying technology of the city, this, of course, it brings with it a whole other set of intensified issues around these new kinds of power forms of power, because, right, like your faucet doesn't keep necessarily, when it was first installed, wouldn't keep track of your habits in the direct way that new surveillance technology can. So we have a whole host of other problems to deal with, but at the same time, this is just part of a trajectory of dealing with our own selves in the places we share with each other. So I like this image for that reason, because I think it speaks to that sort of openness and the possibilities of what this could be, not just the sort of lament about it.
So to come back, I think one of the things, to me at least, in my own interest, is this question is posed as sort of, do we believe that the trajectory of the city should follow the same trajectory as we might have believed that the internet might have followed? And of course, the internet's not a done thing, and there's a lot of complexity there. But this question, I think, of embodiment is a really important one. And I guess it's not to discount any of I think what I actually was getting at with the public space question is precisely, I think the discussion is about a question of equity and what we're seeing in sort of the questions of equity in the broader city. At the same time, I think we have seen in different cases significant investments in public space in, not only in sort of central kind of high rent areas, but in broader geographies that are significant. And I think the opportunity is, in fact, in the city today to see a pushback against the screen, I would say, and sort of the screen as sort of the definition of technology, and the notion of embodiment and collective gathering, and the role that technology might play in that, but in ways that are not screen-based. And there might be other forms of kind of, relationship, I think, that Orit, you suggest around sort of ecology and technology and all of these other forms. And I think that's I think a worthwhile endeavor to explore, and it's not such a simple binary.
No, and I mean the problematic of the screen, obviously on the agenda, and this is where we give Zuck a little bit of a pass. I wanted to come back to a point that cities are not merely consecrated to the pleasures of the piazza. They have also historically been scenes of insubordination, revolt, and resistance. And the idea that somehow the screen facilitated the Arab Spring, if briefly, it redeems it a little bit, but I'm still. How we use the screen.
here is the starting point. We have a lot of technology. We disseminate the ocean with the sensor. But in Toronto, there is not a sensor with screen that take note of pollution 24 hours a day. There is not a sensor that measure the noise. That for me, in certain point, is above what is advised by the health organization. I make an example 6 years ago in a small town in Italy, in 30,000 inhabitants. They put 6 or 7 screens, I do not remember, in the main point, registering the pollution 24 hours a day. After 1 year, when it was seen that for 100 days, the pollution was above what was advised by the European Union, nobody opposed the bicycle path. Because they realized that people see with these eyes and they realize the problem. Today in Toronto we will have problem of dementia because the vibration, the noise, the pollution, and we have a sensor in all the ocean. We disseminate the ocean with very nice, we can say, data. They gather a lot of data. And we do not gather the data that could improve the life of the people here in Toronto. How can we? Yeah.
No, I think you've brought up a very good point. It's actually, I was going to transition to some questions like this, but the two things you're raising are and I think they were alluded to, especially in Orit's presentation. But one is that the ability of this new technology to generate data and feedback, so we know, for example, how to regulate or produce a healthier city, should be used more constructively. That's the first point. But there's a bigger underlying point to that, which is that there's a rationality that if we have that data, like the data we know now about global warming, that somehow we can get societies and companies and governments to act on that. And I have this debate with some of my colleagues who are very devoted to big data. They say, well, if we only have the metrics, then people in positions of authority that have this information and the public will make better decisions. Well, we're not always seeing that that's true. But the question I want to pose to the group around this is that one of the promises of intelligent or smart technology is that, like was done, in the pre-modern era when cities had walls around them, that the technology is going to protect us from things like pollution or floods or the coming, apocalypse of climate change. And maybe is that a true promise? Or is that also something which is an argument for tying together technology and the kind of physical problem of the city, but that it's a problem we're not going to overcome with simple solutions? You want to speak to that?
Yeah, sure.
Because you work on that.
Yeah, I would do a lot on this. Well, two things. There's no question that the technology has an ability, obviously, as you said, to help us rethink our relationships to the environment, to other things, in ways that could make it, quote-unquote, healthier. But the broader question, that's why I still keep coming back to this issue of our approach. It's like, whose data, what are you measuring, and how do you come to care? And those are different stages and different modes and different temporalities around how we're engaging with these screens. So the reason I said this making kin with a machine, like part of the issue is also what are the responsibilities or how do you come to care about whatever it is you're experiencing through whichever screen, whatever data. And then there's a more fundamental question, like I have a friend I work with on a research project working out here in Chemical Valley to work with indigenous groups to be able to sensor, monitor corporate spill-off, et cetera. So this is kind of a use of smart technologies, if you will. One of the real issues, of course, is that for a long time that wasn't even being measured. But then even more, for example, like I've worked in mining installations that say, everything's safe for the environment. Why? Because they just measure the pH of the water going out into their boreal forest. And if that's the only measure of health, but are there not other relations that need to be maintained that these huge sites disrupt? And then the question is, how do we go about having a different relationship to what we're gathering data about that would matter? So there's a lot of different levels of trying to think about that go from who is data for what, and then how then, even if we get it, does anyone come to care, particularly if it doesn't directly affect you? Like, it's one thing when I find out I'm going to get cancer. It's another thing that I will care about the fact that some poor people who live near a chemical factory are going to get cancer. Like,
well, two
That's
things.
very
One,
simple.
I wanted to ask you the question about whether or not that when you were the expert witness, the defense was based on free speech or on property rights.
It was based on free speech, because I think I did show actually that that the distinction the city was making between what was public and private had been collapsed by their own practices, and that the speech that they had sanctioned on the kiosk that they sold off was no different than the speech. Literally, these were the same movie advertisements. Literally the same one 10 feet away from the other. And so I did it actually through a photographic essay.
But to respond to Orit, I mean, there is a big question about how one effectively democratizes the default in any technological system. And I'm reminded of a panel, which probably was 30 years ago, that I was on, in which the high-tech Japanese architect presented the house he designed, which was super automated. It smelled your poop and sent a report to the doctor, and did all sorts of things. And one of the things it did, he claimed, is that when the homeowner begins to play the piano, the windows close. And the German sitting next to him and said, "But what if I want to hear the piano?" Mm-hmm. So this is a kind of microscopic, a microscopic crisis that's very much dependent on the capacity of individuals to shape the nature of their immediate environments, particularly when in conflict with some nominal given that's generated from the top.
Okay, we're going over in time. We need to wrap up. We'll take one or two questions if anyone has a burning question that is sort of related to this actually fairly far-ranging discussion here.
Okay.
That's where the Friday night. Being able to enjoy.
Okay, there's one back here, and Professor Smiley.
Hello. It's not really a question, perhaps it's an observation and a concern. It's kind of as though, on the one hand, like, thank you, Michael, you're right. On the other hand, Orit is telling us that there are many alternative practices for othering, etc., out there. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if there's a gap, and I'm hoping that there's an institutionalization or a success rate of some of those coming near each other. So what I guess for me the Google question ends up being is, how do alternative practices find their way to create social change when the media of social change does not accept those practices or cannot see those practices? And so I find the gap in the conversation unbridgeable at the present time. And my only solace to myself is that the present time is very limited, and next week or next year or 5 years, we're going to laugh at this question. But right now, it seems like there's a gap, and I think it's evidenced here.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I do.
Go ahead.
I wouldn't want to interfere there. Actually, for a lot of groups, or not a lot, let's just say the particular theorists, people, etc. I work with, like, when you're not always loyal and you're not always a member of, you're also arbitraging between groups. And it's not true that there's no relationship. Like, sometimes corporations care deeply, sometimes they don't notice at all. Like, and that's a dangerous space, because of course at any moment Facebook or Twitter can decide to shut something down, or Google if they want to. So it's not in that sense. But so can governments. And so one of the questions is also levering the differentials for groups that are outside either. Actually, like I have no love for, the particular example of indigenous peoples in Canada, like they're not loving Canada and they're not loving Google. And so at that point, like, maybe, but sometimes you're wondering, can you leverage? It's the way environmentalists, I've been looking at, I do a lot on finance, algorithmic finance, machine learning finance, stuff like that. That I did not talk about. But, environmentalists, like, sometimes they team up with their insurance company, or sometimes you try to change risk evaluations on a pipeline to get it stopped, even though that is financialization. You're like playing the same credit debt swap the other side is playing. I'm not saying these are morally good tactics or necessarily excellent, but one also wonders if there's some level of potentiality, and that's why I also always think sometimes about temporalities of politics. Like, can you act now with your credit debt swap but still write fiction so that people can eventually imagine a different world? Like, I think you can. I mean, I have to believe you can, actually, to be honest. I don't really see another way. So I don't have, like, a solution, but I also think that, like, one of the reasons I want to break the kind of basic dialectics that have been surrounding the smart city is that they do not allow those kind of mergers to happen. And certainly we're sitting in a pedagogical institution, so then the question is, like, why aren't we talking about non-Western examples? Where do you decolonize your design and your pedagogy? Where are you introducing these at moments when people can actually maybe afford to play because they're not working for someone yet, So these are the places where I see potentiality. So it's kind of like Deleuze once said, there's no hope for there's no reason to hope, but there's no cause to despair. So I'm pessimistically optimistic. So I don't know if that's an answer.
Pretty good. There was one question, then we'll close. Yes, no?
Shout.
Technology and what was really happening with it. But it seems like a lot of what goes on is to take the really dramatic and mostly quite scary futuristic ideas and to try to pick something from them and reduce its scope to the point where we can solve the problem. So, I mean, the futuristic ideas seem really destructive, scary, and the machines are smart, and that's a bad thing. But then we sort of pick something from it, a problem that doesn't go that far, that we can solve. But what if the real problem actually does go that far? Then the solution probably is to reject a lot of this stuff. And the whole thing about maybe this helps us build a wall to protect us from some things. The most of the things we actually need to protect us from now are technology and smart technology. So this might actually not be building a wall, but actually building up the things that we should be building a wall.
Okay, thank you. Is that good? We should close there. Well, I want to thank our guests. I want to invite you, those of you who are able to join us tomorrow to get further into these issues to come back and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Okay.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. Thank you.
I have to run. I'll take some.
Yeah, thank you.